Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar organized by IDB Invest on how to invest sustainably in Latin America and the Caribbean post-COVID. I'm Michael Stott, the Latin America editor of the Financial Times, and I've been writing about the region on and off since 1990, living in three of the countries, and I've also spent time living in other parts of the world, in Russia, Japan, Middle East, Europe, and so on. So I wanted to give you some announcements before we start, very briefly, because we have 1 hour for this seminar. We want to go fairly briskly so that we can get into the meat of it quickly. So we have around 1,000 people connected today, so thank you to everybody for joining. But that means, of course, we'll keep microphones and cameras of participants off during the session to optimize the quality of the experience for everybody who's on. We can offer you translation into Spanish and Portuguese, and you click on the world icon in the lower part of your screen to access it. And most importantly of all, we've set aside some time at the end for questions from you in the audience. And please feel free to submit those questions using the Zoom question and answer option, which you'll find on your screens. And of course, you can also like questions to push them up to the top of the list and improve their chances of getting asked. So feel free to put your questions in at any point in the seminar. You don't need to wait until the end to do that, of course. So now to the topic of the seminar, sustainable investment. Latin America and the Caribbean, as I'm sure you all know, is one of the hardest hit regions by the COVID-19 health and economic crisis. The World Health Organization has described it as the epicenter of COVID, and it's suffered roughly 43% of global daily deaths for the last 3 months. Capital inflows as a result have slowed significantly. The economies of the region have been seriously hit, among the worst hit in the world, some of them. But of course, every crisis brings opportunities. And it's the opportunities we want to focus on in this session about sustainable investment. Sustainable investment, of course, has become a huge buzzword around the world, hotly debated, hotly followed, lots of people getting involved in it. Very active discussion about its profitability, controversy there too, which I'm sure our panelists will get into. Does it make you more money as an investor if you go for sustainable investing, or less money, or does it make no difference? There are arguments all over the place on that one. I think also what's in no doubt, though, is that Latin America is a region that absolutely needs to build back better. There's a huge need for investment. After this crisis. All of the leaders in business and politics that I've spoken to in the region over the past months are united in agreeing that building back better for Latin America is not a nice aspiration, it's an absolute necessity. So we're going to explore in the webinar some of these investment trends for sustainable investment and looking at what makes Latin America and the Caribbean a good opportunity for sustainable investment and how you can make a difference with that investment. And to do that, we've got 3 excellent speakers I'd like to quickly introduce you to now. Firstly, we have James Scriven, who is the CEO of IDB Invest, the Inter-American Development Bank's private sector arm with more than $12 billion in assets under management and clients in 22 countries. IDB Invest is focused on serving clients and achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And Mr. Scriven is an Argentine-British dual citizen and has previously served as Vice President of Corporate Risk and Sustainability at the International Finance Corporation, and prior to that as CFO of Banco Hipotecario in Argentina. Our second panelist I'd like to introduce you to is joining us from Brazil and is now running one of the most important companies in Brazil in terms of impact, which is BRK Ambiental, the largest private company operating in the sanitation business in Brazil. Her name is Teresa Cristina Quirino Vinaglia, and she has held leadership positions in multinational companies in the areas of telecommunication, energy infrastructure for more than 25 years. And prior to her role at BRK Ambiental, she's served in the AES group and has also worked at NEC in Brazil and at Nextel Telecoms. She's the UN Global Compact spokesperson for water and sanitation and a member of the Leaders Council of the Brazilian Business Council for Sustainable Development. Our third speaker is Scott Mather, from PIMCO, and he's the CIO for US Core Strategies at PIMCO and a managing director in the Newport Beach office, a member of PIMCO's investment committee, and he oversees ESG portfolio integration in the US. And prior to that, he was head of global portfolio management, and before that, portfolio management in Europe. And previously, he co-headed PIMCO's mortgage and asset-backed securities team, and he's been with PIMCO since 1998. Before that, he was a fixed income trader at Goldman Sachs. 26 years of investment experience, so amply qualified to discuss ESG topics. So those are our panelists. I think we're very fortunate to have you all with us. Thank you very much for joining us today. And I'd like to kick off with a few questions. My first question would be for James Scriven at IDB Invest. James, let's start with the name of this webinar, How to Invest Sustainably. Investors are using different terms: impact investing, sustainable investing, ESG investing. How do you understand this, and how do we go about achieving it?
Thank you very much, Michael, and it's a real pleasure having a conversation with you, and especially also with very close partners as Scott and PIMCO and Teresa and in BKRA Ambiental. That is a very good question, because I think it requires that we look back a minute and think about the evolution of impacting investing or sustainable investments. I think this started traditionally more than 15, 20 years ago, when everything was around, let's avoid risks. How can we avoid creating harm? How can we avoid taking additional financial and not financial risk? I think that has evolved over time with the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals, with the creation of the IFC performance standards and all, and moving away from this avoidance to intentional mentality. Let's look for intentional impact. Let's look for intentional development impact. And that evolution is, I think, a very useful one, a very important one that all development institutions have lived through in the last decade or so. I think this helps us, and I'm saying it in particular for us, when you have to take investments, and I know it's the case for Scott and many other investors in the world, that we have to look at the financial sustainability, but also the broader sense of sustainability. If you're investing in 15-year, 20-year investments, you don't only want it to say, am I going to get the money back when I invest at a specific return? But there are many aspects that have an impact: the engagement with the society, what impact does climate have over what you're building? And there are a number of areas that one has to contemplate to look at this. But in particular, what you want to create is value added to this. So I would say moving away from that avoidance mentality to a proactive, intentional mentality is a big concept. But for that, you need some form of measurement. And I know this because I've been working in this business of impacting investors for over 20 years. And only recently institutions have been able to harness an impact measurement. Historically, they have been talking about development impact, additionality, how to add value to what we're doing, but it never was measured. And I think we, together with a number of other institutions, took the lead to start measuring impact in a specific way. And with that is the launch of an indicator that we'll be talking to a bit later. But I think it's important that we look at it, because if you're flying a plane, you want to have all the monitors. You want to have everything up, and not only the credit risk aspects, but also the impact related. So having much more clarity, credibility, and comparability of these indicators are most important. I also want to talk about not only looking at ex-ante indicators, because I think most of the institutions around the world are looking at, if I invest over here, this is the impact I will achieve. And I think we at IDB Invest have made a very important step to not only look at ex-ante, but more importantly, ex-post impact in investing. What has happened on the ground, both a self-assessment and an institution or department within the IDB group that assesses this. Why is this important for this region? I just talked about sustainability, but let me relate to this region. I know this region has the characteristics or the mindset of being a middle-income region. And I do think that given a number of areas that I will focus on, we have been disproportionately hit by COVID and the pandemic. This is the most urban region in the world. The ratio, over 80% of inhabitants in Latin America and the Caribbean live in big cities. Most of them, these mega cities, 6 of the most important mega cities in the world are in the region. This region has a big problem that is mainly informality. So if you combine urbanization and informality, there's no reason, that's the reason why you're seeing, as recently ex-President Ricardo Lagos of Chile has said, this is putting back Chile 10 years. So I can imagine, if you imagine this Chile, the highest rated country in all Latin America and the Caribbean, imagine what that means for lower rated countries. So there's no surprise, and unfortunately, if you look at, even though we're only 8% of the people in the world, or population in the world, 40% of the new deaths are coming out of Latin America and the Caribbean. This gives a very strong indicator that the development role that we all have to play in the private sector and in the private sector has to be the north, has to be the reason why we operate. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much for that, James. I'd now like to come to Scott. Scott, what trends are you seeing in the sustainable investing space globally during the pandemic? And in Latin America in particular, and the Caribbean, what are investors looking for most right now to give them comfort before they invest?
Yeah, well, thanks. I think it was hinted at before, but I think in this case, it's really a situation of investors really saying, well, let's not let this crisis go to waste. We were a little bit worried because we'd seen an exponential increase in investing in sustainable ways before the crisis hit. We were worried it might slow down some of that exponential increase, but actually I would say it's accelerated interest. We see that from our investors all over the world. And perhaps it's because it's really caused them to think about the fragilities in the economic system in a new way and think about the interconnectedness that everyone has with one another all around the world. So there's definitely an acceleration in interest in aligning investment dollars with sustainable investments, and so it's very good to see. And I would say too, there's this nonstop sort of, as you mentioned, this nonstop debate about performance. What does it mean for investors to invest in a sustainable way? We think the right way to characterize it is that a focus on sustainability issues delivers better risk-adjusted returns. So in some cases, it's because you're taking into consideration risks that otherwise might be considered non-financial, but are very material to the success of an investment. But in other cases, it's because there's greater opportunities for growth for those investors focused on sustainable investments and sustainable development. So for us, the people who, and most of the academic studies would suggest this, the people who say, well, you give up performance by doing that, it's only because they're focused, they either have a different time horizon, it's much shorter, or they're certainly market imperfections that some people are taking advantage of when they invest. And that's generally the reason why some people might have those feelings. But in the end, we would say, a focus on sustainable investment, sustainable development. It's all about making the economic pie bigger, making it more inclusive, right, and more resilient. In the end, that's better economics. It's better for investors from a macro perspective. So we think the interest in investing in a sustainable way will really continue to accelerate on this particular crisis as a catalyst for that. A couple of other observations about what we see happening as a result of this crisis. I mean, the sustainable development goals as sort of the most important language of sustainability for investors has really gone mainstream in the last couple of years, and I think it's taking a step up because of this particular crisis. And we've always thought that that's a good idea because there is, as you started out with your questions about, there's a lot of terminology in this space, but there's something that we can all get behind as the sustainable development goals and the language that comes from that. And certainly that's, it's great to see IDB has certainly embraced that in terms of their reporting and in terms of how they've integrated that into some of their tools, like their Delta tool. Another thing that we're seeing is a real acceleration this year, and this is directly as a result of the crisis, just an explosion in the issuance of what I would call, they're not necessarily green bonds, just call them, they fall under the umbrella of sustainable bonds or sustainable loans. So they're sometimes called social bonds, sometimes SDG bonds, sometimes COVID-19 response bonds, those types of things. But they all fall under an umbrella of sustainability-linked financial instruments. And we would say green bonds are a subset of that. Green bonds are now $1 trillion market and still growing rapidly. But we think the overall universe under this sustainable bond and loan universe can be much, much bigger than the green bond universe. So that's an important development really brought about by this particular crisis. I think the other thing that's happened is it's caused a lot of people to really focus on, I think, the other big existential threat that's on the horizon, which is climate change. It's the one that I think is best described as, think about it as a pandemic, that a new one that comes every year. It's worse than the year before, and it never goes away. And that's what climate change will be if it's not addressed, and it will impact our ability to do virtually everything else and to invest sustainably in so many other things. So there is a renewed interest in really addressing those particular issues and making sure that that's part of the building back better. And there's much more investor interest in aligning with that going forward. And lastly, I think there's a bigger interest to think about new ways to partner together. I mean, IDB has been great about this. Events like this are an example of that. But there's a new willingness to think about, well, how does the private sector interact with different institutions in the development world and with sovereigns to truly, really put dollars to work in a new way. And specifically, I think with respect to Latin American and Caribbean countries, what investors are looking for, I think, to give them comfort, as you suggested, is more transparency and better roadmaps. It's very difficult for anything to be sustainable. There has to be growth, but there also has to be a sustainable debt profile in the future. Those two things have to come together. And so, that's what really will give investors comfort, that there's a roadmap to cause things to stabilize, to get growth back to where it needs to be to support even greater investment. And so that's why I think there's a real need for those roadmaps to be created and for them to be explained to the investing universe. And that could come from sovereigns, it could come from all sorts of development institutions. And I think specifically with respect to the opportunity for investment in Latin America and Caribbean countries, one of the new things the crisis has brought about is a very low return environment if you're investing just in the developed world. Very low yields and very low expected returns from many equity investments too, because the growth profiles are going to be much lower for a long period of time than we'd like. But that surplus of savings that's looking for a home can find higher return investment opportunities in Latin America. And we think that differential that's developed between the low return environment in the developed world and the better growth possibilities and higher return environment in Latin America will make it easier to attract more investment. So that's why we think it's an opportune time to think about these new ways to partner together, to think about these roadmaps for investment, and that could really yield some great wins for investors, wins for the local economies, and wins for development institutions.
Thank you very much for that answer, Scott. And I must say, with my journalist hat on, I like that rather scary description of climate change as the sort of eternal pandemic that comes back every year, worse than the year before. A question now for Teresa. We want to talk a bit about Brazil, obviously by far the biggest country, biggest economy in the region, so crucial to ESG investment. While companies may be measuring and monitoring their ESG impact on a national level in Brazil, the narrative is, to put it politely, rather different. How can Brazilian companies cut through that Brazilian political noise? And how's the pandemic changed how your company, BRK Ambiental, monitors and measures ESG?
Okay, so thank you, Michael. Well, the three aspects of the ESG, the environmental, the social, and the governance, corporate governance, I'd say that's totally applicable to the Brazilian current situation. As there are more than 5,000 municipalities demanding water and the sewage in a geographic area as large as Europe. And the challenge and also the opportunities are huge. Brazil is a country with 200 million inhabitants, but we are still struggling to make all its population having access to basic sanitation. Today we have 35 million Brazilians without access to potable water, and 100 million, which is the half of our population, without access to sewage service. And the COVID pandemic put an additional pressure on the sectors of health and the social care, where clean water available for everybody plays an important role against the virus propagation. And recognize this immense challenge, the Brazilian government and the Congress approved last June a new law for those services. And this law, Michael, that enable a structured regulatory framework will create the required conditions to launch a robust cycle of infrastructure buildup. The Brazilian government studies shows that more than $100 billion is needed in the next 10 years to reach the universalization of water and the wastewater. And in parallel, the pandemic put the economy under extreme stress, and these new investments in infrastructure will be crucial to restart the Brazilian economy. So from our side, from BRK side, we are working since 2017, when we assumed the company, in all the three aspects of the ESG agenda. And I'm going to give you a brief example of this agenda. On the environment side, we have a planting of seeding program to protect water resources, which is our core business, and to protect water resources and also the river habitats. And the last year, we protected by planting of seeding an area equivalent of the Central Park in New York. On the social side, we have a broad investment program which has benefited 1 million people since 2017, including training programs for plumbers, men's and women's, promoting income generation across the local communities that we are serving, and environment education projects for students in the public schools. And we are also on the social side stimulating social innovation by accelerating startups focused on the sanitation related solutions. And of course, on the governance, corporate governance, we implemented very high standards of corporate practice, especially a robust compliance program. And in 2019, it's the same as in 2020, because it's a recurrent program. 100% of our more than 5,000 employees, from the top management to the field crew, were trained in compliance practice. So we feel that this is something that needed to be in the center of any company agenda. And that's what we are really doing here in a very challenging, but also a very scenario with plenty of opportunities in Brazil.
Thanks very much for that, Teresa. Now, if I could come back to James, just wondering, James, what you think is the downside of not having internationally agreed impact measurement standards. And, with the rise of COVID bonds, which were mentioned by Scott, less rigorous regulations in some markets, is there a risk of social washing, do you think?
Yes, I mean, we've heard a lot of what we call greenwashing, sustainable washing, and a number of different ways. And I think that's why, as part of our sustainable investment approach, we launched what is called the Risk Management COVID Guidelines, and this impact management framework that gives an approach to how we look at investments. I think the lack of a good measurement creates confusion. Today, we have a number of different stakeholders, in our case, our governments, but also communities, but a number of other investors like PIMCO and BKR Ambiental that have a number of stakeholders that are looking at the impact that our companies is having. So in that context, it's extremely important that we apply the same rigor that we have to our financial performance on the environmental, social, and impact investing. Those are the same. And hopefully this becomes a general practice with all investors. I'm saying it because a number of investors are looking at it in different ways. So having a standard of how it is applied and the rigor is of utmost importance.
Thank you. Well, Scott, if we could hear from you from the sort of CIO perspective. I mean, Europe, I think, has been seen as something of a leader in terms of reporting of ESG. What does Latin America need to do to get to a good level of disclosure and transparency for sustainable investing?
More disclosure and more transparency. And it's coming. It's, there are some regions of the world that are ahead. But the good news is that there's been a lot of progress in terms of people developing frameworks and sort of the common language of how to do it. There's great tools, like I mentioned, IDB's Delta tool is a great way for people to look at, measure, and importantly, continue to report on different types of projects. But there's lots of frameworks that have been very well developed in the past few years that mean that people don't have to reinvent the wheel when they're looking for different types of information. There's things like the Sustainable Accounting Standards Boards that have templates for more than 70 different types of industries. You've got the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which now has also a large body of templates and examples. So both investors can go there and issuers or people seeking investment can go there and see the types of things, see perfect examples of what investors would like to see, both on an ex-ante basis as well as an ongoing basis. And so I think that's really going to make it much easier. And I also think there's for Latin American, Caribbean countries, I think there's a great opportunity to take advantage of their voluntary national reviews that are conducted through the UN and others to sort of lay out the roadmap for investment, what the priorities are from the state budget, what they're seeking from the private sector, and really help prioritize and guide investors into those places. So we've been working with others to try to get both those voluntary national reviews to outline those roadmaps for investment, but also to find it, build a tool that makes it easier for investors to connect with these opportunities and easier for them to look at the wide range of possibilities, decide what really is the correct investment for them and their investors, and begin that conversation. Kind of the last observation is, I think, while I said more information is critical, there is also, we sort of sense the possibility that people are letting the fact that information is always going to be imperfect get in the way of more disclosure and of moving forward. And we think that's a mistake. I mean, investors deal with uncertainty all the time. We're never going to get it right. We're always going to make forecasts, and they're always going to be wrong. But the important thing is, we're used to dealing with the imperfection. Give more information. Don't let the struggle for perfection get in the way of moving forward. And so we think if both issuers, those looking for investment, and other investors that feel as we do approach it from that perspective, then it should open the doors to a lot more investment going forward. And that's that's certainly what we're hoping for.
Thanks, Scott. And just quickly as a follow-up, I mean, are there any countries or markets you'd single out in Latin America as having done a particularly good job on forcing better ESG disclosure?
Well, you certainly see, you know, in the case of Latin America, I mean, I think there's some that have taken big steps forward and some that have gone on pause, and understandably so. This crisis is really challenging. So, you know, I think it's easy to look for, as James mentioned, the higher rated countries generally have done a better job, but typically they have more resources employed in that area. I guess we're just hopeful that that it broadens and it deepens. There's certainly more that everyone can do, and not just the higher rated countries, but that's typically been the way it's been. But there's plenty of room for everyone to improve. And as I mentioned, as an investor, we're not frightened away from opportunities just because people haven't had the experience or haven't had the ability to disclose in the same way that maybe their neighboring countries or neighboring competitive companies have had. Because and the other thing I think that's been missing is people haven't had these templates.
Right.
Okay, so that's why we're optimistic, just saying there's so much out there now that it does, you know, it doesn't take a lot of resources and it doesn't take a lot of creativity as used to be needed to bring your level of disclosure up to the level of those that are best in the region.
Okay, thank you. And if I can come back to James now, I mean, we've talked about the need to build back better. What new projects and deals are you trying in Latin America and the Caribbean to counter the impacts of COVID on the region?
Great question. I think we in the investment community have a responsibility to lead and show the way. And I think if you look at the issuances that we have done, both IDB and IDB Invest in the market, are all in the context of what we call social bonds or sustainable bonds. But let me focus on a few examples that we've done with clients. And I'm saying this because in the context of a pandemic, there is a lot of room to build back better. So a few examples. One, last week we issued the first performance-based incentive in gender bonds in the world with Banco de Vivienda in Colombia. Second, together with Banco de Guayaquil, as you know, Guayaquil has been one of the hardest hit cities in the entire Latin America and the Caribbean. And we work together with Banco de Guayaquil to enhance their program that's called Banco de Barrio. And in that context, we helped them issue and guaranteed a social bond. Last but not least, working with a manufacturing company, a textile company in El Salvador, called El Catex, working with the supply chains to adapt their production to create more masks and more protection for social workers, health workers, to be able to be protected from the pandemic. So I think these are good examples of how we've worked with a number of our clients to be able to adapt their responsibility to be much more open and much more sociable. So I think in that respect, these concepts of social bonds, green bonds, gender bonds are leading the way, because we're attracting investors from within the region and outside of the region by using our very strong rigor in how we measure ex-ante and ex-post development impact.
Thank you. I'm just curious, you mentioned it was a first, the gender bonds. Can you just say a little bit more about exactly what the gender bonds are and how they're different to what's come before?
Sure. There is, if you look at the financial system around the world, there is probably between 45 to 50% of the SMEs in the world are either managed or controlled by women, but only less than 10% of those SMEs have access to financial services. That's why we, together with many other multilaterals, have focused on women entrepreneurs as a way of bringing people out of poverty or creating opportunities for women. One aspect traditionally, you probably all heard about a lot, is the microfinance business, where in that area, something that has been created in places like Bangladesh and India and has been working very successfully across in countries like Bolivia, Peru, Chile, Mexico, and others. That has been a very important tool to be able to access financial services for micro entrepreneurs, that primarily most of them, 90% of those are women. But there is a missing middle, that is SMEs managed by women. And these have much less financial services. So when we think about a gender bond, when we think about that business opportunity, we're looking at a section of the population that today has less access to financial services. So we've got a measurement of what we call gender bonds and how we channel that money to women entrepreneurs to expand their own businesses. This is an example that we did with Banco de Guayaquil. We worked together with WIFI. WIFI is a program being managed by the World Bank, where a number of different donors have participated and given the World Bank the management of what we call concessional funds. And we created what is called a performance-based incentives, in which we provide a bond to Banco de Guayaquil, and when they continue to increase their portfolio of women-owned SMEs, we give them a rebate with a lower interest rate. Why? Because we do believe, and we've seen around the world, that women pay better. So in that respect, we feel that this performance-based is actually adapting the reality of the performance of these segments of the population.
Thank you. And just one question for Teresa before we open it up to the audience Q&As. Teresa, we've talked about how urbanized Latin America is, one of the most urbanized regions in the world. Do you think technology is going to help Latin America de-urbanize and create opportunities for smaller, maybe more sustainable towns or cities?
Moot. So what I was saying, Michael, is that at the level of urbanization and the way the cities are organized has a long historical evolution and a reason. And in Brazil, we could say that, taking São Paulo as an example, the government are looking to maximize the use of the existing infrastructure. And under this concept, the people has to live near to the jobs they have and where the existing infrastructure can be maximized, like electricity, telecommunication, water, sewage, transportation, hospitals, and etc. And this solution can minimize the creation of a new infrastructure, but at the same time, maximize the use of existing one. And as a long-term view, the process to de-urbanize, make all sense for better quality of life. And for sure, new technologies can have an important impact, like remote work, schooling, remote health support, as we are seeing right now during the pandemic. And the sustainable cities will demand the supply of renewable energy, the proper discharge of sewage, the proper construction of ecological buildings and houses, and so on. So in both cases of urban policies, government urban policies, maximizing the existing infrastructure and the building up new sustainable cities brings a range and demands a range of diverse technologies that needed to be applied, improved, and some I think that still need to be developed. Just bringing to the sewage and sanitation sector and to BRK, we are working with the solutions to provide sanitation service to attend urbanized and not urbanized areas. We serve a broader range of municipalities, those with 2,000 inhabitants and those with 4 million inhabitants. And given these extremes in number of population being served, innovation and technology are crucial. Just to give you an example, we are implementing treatment plants based on innovative technology that take up less space in more populated areas as well as individual treatment plants for rural areas. And we also have harnessed technology to handle the disposal of sludge that's from the results of sewage treatment. It's a very critical part of the treatment chain. And also a technology to reduce water losses that in Brazil reached the amazing 40% level. So that's the way we see that technology can really support small and large cities to handle all this challenge.
Thank you, Teresa. Shocking figure, that 40%. Good Lord. Well, I'd like to come now to some of the questions. You've got some excellent questions, so many thanks to everybody who's attending the webinar for putting them in, and do feel free to keep contributing. I'd like to start with one from Ursula Salinas, who asks an excellent question. How can Latin America and the Caribbean attract more resources to aid in the recovery when other emerging markets like Asia are recovering quicker? So Scott, with your sort of global lens here at PIMCO, I mean, how does Latin America stack up here? You know, Ursula's right, Asia's growing much faster. Why should investors bother with Latin America?
Well, it is true, right, that, for a host of reasons, many countries in Asia have fared better on exiting the crisis thus far. But in many cases, the investment opportunities aren't necessarily as great. Yes, there's certainly some fast-growing economies, but for global investors, right, diversification, don't forget, is also plays a big role. So yes, growth. It's growth now. It's growth in the future. But as a large institutional investor, we're always looking for ways to diversify, and increasingly investors will too. And investors looking to invest in developing economies, won't want to cluster their exposure up in any particular area. So I think there's plenty of room to think about the vast pool of savings that are trapped in low returning parts of the developed world, and thinking there's room for a new wave of investment that goes not just into the countries that have been least harmed in this particular pandemic, but realizing we will get past this. Maybe it takes another 6 months, 1 year, maybe longer. But on the other side, some of the faster growth potentials in the world do reside in Latin and Caribbean countries. A lot has to do with the demographic profile, and when you think about that, it's very vastly favorable in most of the emerging market world, including many Latin American countries. So that's part of the picture. I don't think that investors view this as terminal damage for any particular economy anywhere in the world, right? A lot of hardship, a lot of rebuilding, but just a tremendous amount of opportunity too. So I think we don't see many investors, for instance, saying, well, I'll only invest in those countries that got through the COVID crisis better than others. It creates new challenges, but as I mentioned, there's a lot of reasons that investors want to take a diversified approach and not view it through the lens as this is a pandemic that never ends.
Well, that's good to hear. Thank you, Scott. We've got another excellent question here from Alberto Linares about definitions, and I'd like to come to you, James, with this one. He's asking, about how we really should define sustainable investment. How do we recognize that a particular investment's sustainable, and is there a maximum period for such sustainability to be considered as such?
I would say that, first of all, sustainability, as its word said, is something that is here throughout the life. And that makes it important that whatever we build, whatever we invest in, it creates not only a do no harm concept, but particularly to create a positive impact on the triple bottom line: population, the world, and financial services. So in that respect, I would say that a sustainable investment is one that takes a comprehensive view of the impact that this investment is having, and it creates a positive delta on that investment.
Okay, Thank you. And we've got a couple of questions here which I can sort of put together about countries, trying to identify countries that are best positioned for impact investment in a post-COVID scenario. Javier Iglesias asking about that, and Laura Hills has a similar question. So can one of the speakers identify 3 to 5 factors that distinguish the highly rated countries from the rest? What core characteristics set those countries apart? So where do we think the countries are that are best positioned for impact? Maybe Scott, you could help me with that one.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question without an easy answer in a lot of ways, because where investors can sometimes make the biggest impact is sometimes in the places that are maybe the hardest to invest and hardest for people to get their arms around, just requires more research. But that's where I think, you look, historically, I mentioned it's higher rated countries. If you just look at rating agencies, that's because they've done a better job managing their economies, their debt dynamics, and they typically have institutions that are functioning better. Everything from central banks to local municipalities and how they work together, et cetera. So there's a whole framework there that causes them to be in a better position to provide clarity, transparency, and stability to investors. But that's not necessarily where you can get the greatest returns as an investor, or where you can get the greatest or make the greatest impact. So I think what I'm encouraging people to do on this particular webinar is to think about thinking about looking for those places that maybe they haven't looked before, that might be harder to invest, but where they can have a big impact and where the financial returns might be greater because there's just been less focus and it's more difficult to invest from the institutional perspective. But it doesn't mean that it's inferior. In fact, it could be better. And that's where partnering with willing, enable institutions that have so much experience and have the people on the ground like IDB is really powerful. And so that's what we're looking to do. Look for those new opportunities that maybe have been overlooked because they're too hard to find, or they've been too small, and so, or they've required partnerships, some sort of blended finance type of approach that all the pieces haven't been brought together yet. But that's where we think the big opportunities are in the future, especially for investors that want to have impact and want to have the possibility of earning those higher returns.
Thank you, Scott. And we've talked there a bit about geography. There's also a question from Vanessa Sandoval about sectors. Which sectors would be key channels or instruments in driving sustainable investment? What do you think are the key sectors for sustainable investment?
Michael, my view is that water and wastewater, for sure, it's a sector that needs a lot of investment especially in Brazil, but not only Brazil, I think in Latin America as a whole. The power, the renewable power, transportation, ports. I think that mainly these are the sectors that may have attention. So water, wastewater, power, renewable power. And also in Brazil, as we are a sizable country in geography, in space, so we are a huge country. Infrastructure in roads is also very important to connect the cities, to improve the productivity, to transport the soil and the production. So I see that this has a huge impact on the communities that are surrounding all this infrastructure. On the other hand, it's very important for any country that really has huge challenges to improve in infrastructure, that the regulatory behavior be very stable to provide also to the investor the security required to do a long-term investment with a high impact in the social and the environment. So I think that in Latin America, there's something that we have a space to improve. but at least in Brazil, I'd say that the pandemic, it was an opportunity, and as we see in some sectors, we have the government approve of new legislation, not only for water and wastewater, but also for gas, that will really enabling behavior where the investment will be attractive for investors.
Right, thank you. Thank you very much for that. Also, an interesting one here about organizations pointing out that the WHO is coordinating responses on health, but who should be coordinating sustainable investment at a global level internationally? Which organization ought to be leading and coordinating in development banking and ESG investing missions? James, I just wonder if you have a view on that one.
Sure. Let me, if I may, also stress a few points as both Scott and Teresa have mentioned. I do think that some of the larger and most sophisticated countries of the region are probably today have closer and more stable form of looking at investments and rating investments. But that means it's more crowded because of that. And if you are looking for diversifying either sectors or countries, you have to go into markets that have been unexplored, uncharted territories for many. I'm saying this because my boss, Luis Alberto Moreno, some time ago in one of the roadshows we did, he was explaining to the community in Asia that Latin America was not for beginners. And that is right. And I think it's important, the collaboration and the sharing of information when you look into these smaller economies, the more difficult economies, which don't have enough research either from rating agencies or investors. And moving into global coordination, I think the UN Development Goal, the UN played an enormous role for the society of creating the UN Development Goals. And I do believe in that respect, all multilateral organizations, either globally like the World Bank or the regional development banks, have a big role to play in applying those standards as a north to the investments that we do. There's a lot of coordination around and alongside all multilateral organizations of how you measure impact and how you evaluate the impact. So I would say that the answer to that is the global or regional development institutions that have been doing this for either 60 years or 30 years or 40 years, depending on the region, in our case 60 years, are the best actors to harmonize, but also accompany hand-in-hand investors into this space.
Thank you, James. And there's a very specific question here for Scott at PIMCO from Roberto Peralta. He says, does PIMCO have a preferred country or sector or SDG to invest in Latin America?
Well, I think that I'm not going to, name and shame individual countries. As I mentioned before, it's not really sort of our view that I mean, some are certainly more difficult to find investment opportunities than others, but sometimes that's where the greatest rewards and impact is. Look, for Latin American and Caribbean countries, there are so many sustainable development opportunities and needs, but we tend to be very focused more on the infrastructure. I mean, the infrastructure can, in many cases, it's the enabling mechanism, or financial institutions. And James talked about some of the initiatives there to sort of broaden economic opportunity. Those types of, those two areas are most interesting to us because you can think about them as enabling forces. I mean, yes, there's other great needs, both in, in health and education and all sorts of areas. But if you don't solve some of the basic needs, then, and of course, those are very capital intensive and in many cases takes a lot of investment dollars, but that's where institutional investors such as ourselves can play a bigger role. And working to sort of pool those investments in a new way, and we've been working with IDB and thinking about some new concepts there, because one of the issues is for instance, one of our clients, very many of them, they may have a large group of assets, but to take just one exposure, in one country may be a good investment, but it's just too burdensome for them to think about doing that. So how can we pool opportunities together and present them that diversification that they're looking for, and give them the size that they want, where it's meaningful enough that they can devote the resources to track it, to work with it, so on and so forth. So I think that's the answer, rather than trying to think about, you know, the one country where it might be easiest and where it might be the most crowded in terms of a lot of investment dollars already looking to be put to work.
Okay, thank you, Scott. There is a following on the topic of collaboration. Maximilian de Kepper has a question for you. Maximilian would like to know whether you could give us an example of how you're collaborating with the Brazilian public sector to maximize impact.
We have many ways where we collaborate with the public authorities, and concessions of water and wastewater is a way to collaborate, the PPPs. But more than the concessions, we develop program in the local communities that helps the municipality on creating jobs, and also to have a broad environment awareness for the children. So we used to have a good partnerships with the local education organizations linked to the municipalities, and also the environmental secretaries in each cities that we operate, to try to establish a positive agenda that help the municipality to see that all the benefits of preserving our rivers, the benefit of investing in pipes underground to collect and treat sewage, because we are preserving our rivers. And so bringing this awareness to our children in the first school, and also developing programs to training the local people to have a technical expertise that can help them to find a job and income at the end of the day, are the type of partnership that's been very successful. And this is being successful in those cities where we have 2,000 inhabitants, and those metropolitan regions where we have 4 million inhabitants. So I would say that we were able to develop this program in a way to where we can have scalability, so we can share all over the places where we are operating.
Thank you. Thanks. And I think there's just want to squeeze in a very quick last one to James before we wrap up, which is from David, who asks, you know, we've seen a huge increase in social and sustainable bonds, 87% more on average this year than last year. What do you make of this? Do you think this is a good thing? Is this going to end in tears? What's your view?
I hope it never ends in tears. I hope it ends in clapping. And I do think that it has a lot to do with how today the society is looking at investments. This concept of moving away from creating value only for shareholders to creating value for stakeholders. And many CEOs around the world, including Jamie Dimon and others, have subscribed to that concept of creating value for all stakeholders. And in that context, the social aspects of what we're doing are primarily important. So I think the best thing that we can do is put rigor around that, put monitoring systems around that, have a coherent and a harmonized way of looking at it. But I think this is here to stay, because I do think that the new society, the new investors are looking at that. We had a meeting on our way to Davos. What seems to be in January, it seems to be another world. But actually, we're having a conversation with UBS, one of the private fund managers in the world, more important with family businesses. And they were saying that while the mother or the father that created the wealth, all their sons and daughters have inherited that wealth, they're no longer asking questions about the risks, the returns. They're actually asking about, am I having a positive impact on the environment? Am I having a positive impact on society? So I think that this is an important generational change that we need to be aware of, harness and get the best out of it.
A good example of that generational shift, isn't there, in I think one of the great business dynasties of the world, the Murdochs, where you've seen Rupert Murdoch, who built an extraordinary media empire. One of his sons, James, has become very interested in the environmental movement, is married to someone who's very active in that area, and is now very interested in campaigning on that issue, very, very aware of that. So yes, plenty of examples of how the next generations are thinking differently. Well, I just wanted to wrap up now and thank our panelists for their fantastic contributions. James, for all your insights from the IDB Invest perspective, Scott for the PIMCO view from the investor side, and Teresa from the Brazilian side there at the coalface, working on projects that are making a difference every day to millions of people's lives. And to thank all of you for attending and participating and for all your questions. I think you've heard from the speakers, this is here to stay. This is not a passing fad. It's an enormously important new area for investment, and the pandemic has underlined just how important it is, and as we've heard, has accelerated the trends. IDB has a publication out on impact investing, which you're welcome to look at. It's in the chat for this webinar, and the URL is www.idbinvest.org/impact. So feel free to have a look at that, and let's hope we see impact investing go strength to strength. Well, thank you all very much for joining. Thank you to the panelists, and goodbye.
Thank you all, and especially thanks to you, Michael. And good to join a panel with both Scott and Teresa. Good partners, very close partners.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to participate. Thank you, Michael.